Hello. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jesse Berger, and I'll be moderating our discussion on Lope De Vega and Shakespeare. This is the first part of our Hispanic Golden Age Classics series this year, the third year we're doing this festival. And this year it's centered around an online reading of Lope De Vega's The Capulets and the Montagues, translated by Dakin Matthews, which we'll be performing live online this coming Monday. These events are sponsored by the Spain USA Foundation and presented in partnership with UCLA's Diversifying the Classics initiative. We have some real experts this evening to discuss Lope, Shakespeare, and their respective takes on the most famous star-crossed lovers and their warring families. We'll also be taking questions from the live online audience. So if you have any, and I hope you do, I suspect there'll be many, please just type them into the chat on YouTube or Facebook, and our Associate Artistic Director, Nathan Winkelstein, will be monitoring those questions from behind the scenes, and we'll answer as many as we can in the hour to come. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists tonight. First up, we have Dakin Matthews, who is the translator and actor extraordinaire of our reading of The Capulets and the Montagues. And we have Barbara Fuchs, who is the director of Diversifying the Classics at UCLA and a distinguished professor of English and Spanish. And we also have Rhonda Sharrah, PhD candidate from UCLA and member of Diversifying the Classics as well. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Are you there?
Hello.
There you are. Can you all hear me okay? Great.
Yes.
Yep. Good. Well, let's just dive in. I wanted to start, first of all, if you don't mind, I'll start with Dakin, because this is your translation of Lope's play.
Okay.
We'll just start with a broad-based question of why and how did you first come to Lope, and what drew you to translate this particular play?
I actually came to translating Golden Age plays very late in life and purely by accident. My primary study as an academician is Shakespeare, but I was also a dramaturge at the Old Globe to Jack O'Brien, and he happened to be on a plane with the great, however you wish to take that word, John Simon. And John Simon sat next to him in first class and asked him why the Old Globe didn't do more continental classics. And Jack said, well, we do a lot. He says, yes, but you don't do some of the Spanish plays. Then there's one in particular that's probably the most famous Spanish comedy ever written. Why don't you do that? And Jack said, well, maybe I will. What's it called? And he said, it's called El Desdén con el Desdén, which I translated as Spite for Spite. And when Jack got off the plane, he called me and said, scare me up a translation of a Spanish comedy called El Desdén con el Desdén, because John Simon said it's great and we should do it at the Old Globe. So I said, okay. And I scoured the internet, and there had never been an English translation of the play, which I was rather surprised to find out, because it was, as I began to research, it was a very popular play in Hispanic literature and on the theater. That same month, I was scheduled to shoot a movie in New Orleans where I was what's called rain cover. The guy that they sit in a hotel room in case it rains, then they'll shoot his scenes. But if they don't, he waits to the very end of the month and shoots him at the very end. So I was going to be in New Orleans in the French Quarter for a month, already far too overweight for my own good. And I thought, I've got to find something to do that will keep me out of all these restaurants. So I bundled up my old Spanish grammar, my Spanish dictionary, a rhyming dictionary, and a copy of the play. And I hadn't done anything in Spanish for maybe 20 years, maybe more. And I sat in my hotel room for a month and translated the first act. And I showed it to a bilingual friend of mine, and she said, yes, that's very lovely, but that's not what the Spanish says. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure I know that. I'm just working it out. And basically it took me about a year, I guess, and a lot of help, a lot of consultation. And I finished this play by Moreto, and I just was, I was bitten by the bug. It just struck me as there's a whole world of plays of which I'd read maybe 3 ever in I mean, I used to teach world theater, so you always are going to be familiar with Life is a Dream or The Mayor of Zalamea or Fuente Ovejuna or Dog in the Manger, but not the comedies so much. And there were so many great comedies, as I found out later. So I just began to do it almost like a hobby, almost like doing crossword puzzles in the morning. I embarked on a 25-year career of producing one of these every couple of years. And I went to Alarcon for about the next 3 and then started to diversify and moved into, sometimes I would pick plays that had never been translated, and sometimes I would pick plays that had been translated. So I just finished my 11th last month, which is Calderon's Coriolanus play, which is a totally weird play. And I thought actually my 10th was my last, but the pandemic put me back in touch with my addiction to Spanish crossword puzzles. So that's how that all happened. This one I chose quite early on because I felt if anything was producible for American audiences, because anything that was written in this period could be done on a Shakespearean stage. If anything would attract the attention of an artistic director or of a Shakespeare festival audience, it would be something like this. So that's why I sort of jumped into Castelvino.
That's right, and you're right about that, because it's been sitting on my desk for a few years where I've been saying we've got to do this.
Yeah.
And we've explored some really fascinating plays by writers that I hadn't heard of, Anna Caro and now her name is slipping out of my mind. Sor Juana, of course, Sor Juana, which were both terrific plays, but we hadn't touched Lope or Calderon or any of the ones that are known, at least to me. And we've been sort of waiting until we have to do one of these that really resonates with the Shakespearean and Jacobean oeuvre, and I knew there were several, and this was at the top of my list for that reason alone, but also because it's really good and your translation is so good. Could you talk a little bit about just a few of the differences and the similarities? I'm sure people will be interested in hearing a little bit about.
Again, as far as staging, any play written in the Golden Age can be staged on a Shakespearean stage with a Shakespearean company by a Shakespearean director. That's one of the great things about it. It has because it's so unfamiliar. There are certain things, and because it developed in a certain isolation on the Iberian Peninsula, there are things about it that are unfamiliar for audiences, but not impossible to appreciate. One is the intense versification and the use of rhyme. The plays are written in various rhymes, not just in a single rhyme, but in what's called polymetry. Up to 6 or 7 different stanzaic forms may occur. In this play, I'm pretty sure we have a couple of quatrains, a 5-line stanza, a 6-line stanza, an 8-line stanza, a 10-line stanza, and a 14-line stanza, as well as the rough equivalent of blank verse and alternate rhyme, roughly. So, and the playwright will write in certain verse forms for certain themes or for certain scenes, and then switch to another and switch back and switch around. It's just that we're not used to. Secondly, of course, English is very rhyme poor, not being a very inflected language. So it's very, very, very difficult to find rhymes in English. But I decided rather rashly that rhyming verse was necessary for Golden Age plays if an audience was going to experience them in their fullness. So I've always written in rhyming verse for everything. The other challenge for most plays, not so much for Castelvino y Montagues, is the length of many speeches. Many plays in the repertoire have extraordinarily long speeches, which actually actors find fun to do and audiences find fun to listen to. It's very performative in that regard. We have it a couple of times in Shakespeare in its early, the opening of Comedy of Errors, we get one of those. In a sense, we get it at the very end of his career, Prospero's almost barely interrupted long exposition in the Tempest, but they're all over Spanish drama. A lot of them are much longer than they need to be. Some of them don't even have anything to do with the play very much in some cases. They're just high wire acts for great actors and great poets to show off their skills. So that's a little difficult.
And were they done? This is a question. Maybe you can answer this, Dakin. I actually don't know the answer to this. Were they done midday outdoor
Yep.
theater?
Yep.
So my memory of many of these speeches, and I'm thinking about just a few of the plays that I know, is that they do often feel like they're really just talking to the audience, conversationally.
Yeah, and you know, they're marvels of rhetoric. That's the thing. That I think the Spanish theater went far more toward the display of rhetorical ingenuity and favored it more than the English theater did. The English theater moved, I think, more towards characterization. And not that rhetoric isn't characterization. My theory is rhetoric is characterization. If you want to know what makes a man tick, I would say listen to him talk.
Yeah, so that's a very David Mamet way of thinking too, isn't it?
Yeah. So, yeah. But the Spanish theater does have that challenge for the playwright or for the translator and for the audience. But if you can pull it off, it's heavily appreciated. This is my experience with that.
Barbara, if I can turn to you for a little bit more scope on just the intersection of Lope's career and oeuvre, and and I'm fascinated by two things. One is, first of all, I just don't know Lope de Vega's work or life as well as I know Shakespeare's for obvious reasons. But I would love to hear just a little bit more about where this play fits in Lope's oeuvre and anything about the intersection of Shakespeare and Lope. I don't think there is an actual intersection. It's more parallel, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So first of all, just a funny anecdote about the plays in the daylight. In another of Sor Juana's plays, which Dakin has actually translated as One House, Many Complications, there's a running joke about the fact that they're in the dark, because in fact, the audience, everyone has to pretend that they're in the dark, but this is happening in the daytime. So it's part of the involving everyone in the illusion. I mean, I think that we tend to overestimate the differences between these theaters sort of at our peril. I am really struck by the parallels. Both Lope and Shakespeare, were born in fairly humble circumstances and were of that first generation of authors who managed to become huge successes in the commercial theater. They were both very interested in writing plays that would please audiences. One of the amazing things that we have from Lope is he actually writes a sort of manifesto-like text about what it means to write plays my way, the new way, the way that I have established for everyone to write in now. And so it's called the new art of writing plays in our time. And, it's the kind of thing that people would die to have from Shakespeare. But we have a text from Lope that says, these are the ingredients of a successful play. And one of the things that critics always point out is that what he really emphasizes is the audience is in charge, right? We want to please the audience. You've got to give the audience what it wants. And that is the mark of a successful play. And so I'm really struck by those parallels, right? That recognition that for the play to work, it needs to work in performance, right? Forget Aristotle, forget the unities, and actually write a play that works. And Lope is an absolute master at this. I think another thing that is interesting to think about is, we talk about the significance of the first folio and how early was Shakespeare recognized as being special. In Lope's time, to say it's Lope-like is to say something is magnificent, right? Is the Lope about, your steak or your dress or whatever? Like, it's Lope just means it is first rate. And that's how incredibly well-known he was and admired he was. And we have about 800 extant texts from Lope. We think he may have, he claims to have written many more than that. He is a sort of veritable playwriting machine. He supposedly was writing about 20 pages a day for a very long life. Like Shakespeare, he's sort of in between the commercial theater and sort of patronage structures, right? He's like the secretary to a duke, probably his intermediary in a lot of love affairs. But he's a man of the commercial theater, and he's riding that wave of the commercial theater becoming, you know, like the TV of our time, right? Like the place where the exciting cultural narratives are happening. And everyone goes to the theater, and the demand is such because a new play has to be shown every afternoon, and someone has to write it. And what better than a play by Lope?
Wow, that's amazing.
He was in the Armada, wasn't he, as well?
Yes, he's on the Azores expedition and on the Armada. So he has he sort of flirts with being a soldier. He's making his living from playwriting, you know, by fairly early on. And then he has an incredibly sort of colorful life, many lovers. He's exiled from Madrid because he is so obnoxious when a particular actress leaves him, and, you know, is writing things about her and her family. And so he's exiled to Valencia. So there's a kind of interesting moment of looking at the capital from afar. But then he's soon back in Madrid, and he's part of an incredibly lively scene there, I think also analogous to Shakespeare's London. There's literary academies, there's people having, you know, poetic contests. There's just a kind of, in fact, the text that I was mentioning, the Arte Nuevo, is presented to one of these literary academies, right? Because there is a kind of, you know, fervor of literary creation in Madrid at that time.
He also got himself ordained a priest.
Yes, I was getting to that, Dakin. Yes, so there is this very interesting.
As most of them were. I mean, most of the playwrights in the first wave or second wave were. I remember I went to his house in Madrid when I was performing at the Teatro Español, and we had a little tour of his room where his study was, and he has a desk on one side, and there's a fire pit at the other end of the room. And apparently after the plays or after whatever was going on, the artists that were associated with this little group would sit around the fire pit and talk about, you know, the plays and things like that. And I pulled out of my pocket a 20-line speech from Capulets and Montagues. There were like 3 or 4 of us on this tour. And I said, if everyone wouldn't mind, I'd like to read something. And everybody kind of looked at me. And I read this speech from Capulets and Montagues. And I said, thank you for bearing with me. I wanted to do that because that speech may actually have been written in this room, and I thought it would be kind of fun to read it.
Sure, that's beautiful. Does anyone know, Rhonda or Barbara or Dakin, where this play fits? And, you know, we talk about Shakespeare's oeuvre and the way his plays, we sort of have an idea of when he wrote what plays and a sense of his development as a playwright. And I'm curious if we have a sense of Lope's development, where the Capulets might fit in that.
Yeah, you know, there's less precision about the date of this play. We think it's sometime around the turn of the 17th century. Lope publishes several parts of his, several collections of his plays, but this one doesn't get published until 1647. So we're not exactly sure about the dating. He's playing with a lot of these ideas of, you know, the love interest. I mean, I think, I don't know how much we want to give away to the audience, but it's generically, right, it's a very different play than Shakespeare, right? It's a very different kind of animal. And that is, I would say that Lope's idiom is much more like this play throughout his career. The other thing that I think I didn't mention earlier, and that I do want to point out, and this also brings us to the differences in the play itself, is that Lope is very often writing for famous actresses, not just entangled with them, but because there are actresses on the Spanish stage, he can think about a centrality for the female characters in the plays. He can think about a kind of agency and initiative that corresponds to, you know, the diva in the cast, and that actually being, you know, a grown woman. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about when we look at these cases where we have a sort of pair of texts, one that, you know, both authors sort of drawing from the same fount, but often coming up with very different treatments, right? That sense of what difference does it make to have actresses on stage, and how does that impact the Spanish version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, speaking to drawing from the same sources, we have this play that it's based on the same source. So there are these tales that were kind of circulating, like folk tales since like the Middle Ages, also like historical things that had been turned into tales that were like in these collections. And this was one that was in a collection of novellae in like Italian, but was translated into a lot of languages. So I think the tendency might be from our vantage point today, to look at this and say, oh, Lope's version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. But of course, that's not the case. This is an instance of there being this kind of common store of tales throughout Europe and including England that people were drawing from. And they didn't know of each other's versions, or anyway, Lope didn't know of Shakespeare's version, as far as we know. So these were coming totally, differently, but from a common source, and showing sort of these deeper connections, going back to the sources for a lot of plays, which they were, taken from a lot of things. You mentioned also like doing more Spanish stuff. You guys are going to be doing Night of the Burning Pestle, and we just had a production of that at Griffith Park out here, and we talked a little bit about how that's a play that's written by a later generation of English playwrights who were drawing on that at that point Spanish plays and Spanish literature as sources. So Night of the Burning Pestle is drawing on some elements of Don Quixote, and then there were a series of other plays, including one that's called Love's Cure, that is a version of a Spanish play that we translated called The Force of Habit. And so there's a lot of these connections that people don't really know about, because as Dakin said, there's just not as much knowledge about this, vast corpus of Spanish plays, and partially because they're not as available in translation as you might expect. So that's a lot of what our project at Diversifying the Classics is, which is making translations of these plays, making them freely available and making them for performance. So they're not like academic editions. They're specifically made to be performable and to be, kind of have the footnotes that could explain things to like actors rather than really sort of nitty gritty. And we've been working on that and for about 8 years, I want to say. And we have a collection of them at this point. And we had, to what Dakin has been saying, we were doing a lot of comedies because the comedies haven't been translated as much. And they also often, like Barbara was saying, have these really strong central female roles, sort of like pulling the strings and like the elements of the farce going, where there's these plans where there's mistaken identities and, people in disguises and things like that. So we've tried to focus on those kinds of things that are really a strength theater, and ones that could have all kinds of interest to English audiences or English speaking audiences today that aren't just necessarily like connected to English plays, but this one has both, because like Barbara was saying, it has this really, kind of the Juliet role has a lot more agency and is a lot more kind of, sly and putting a lot more plans into action than the one that we know of from the Shakespeare version. And so it kind of is able to bring out these strengths of the Spanish theater while also kind of being an interesting companion piece to the one that we know. And definitely as an audience member watching it, you get a lot of interest from being like, oh, that's not how that's supposed to go. That's not what I remember from that. And there's a lot of these little moments that are like that, without going into too many spoilers.
Yeah. That's true.
I was going to add to that. It's true that the other two companion pieces that I've translated, which is the Henry VIII play and the Coriolanus play, the women's roles are all vastly more more agency for the women. There are two powerful women in the Coriolanus and in the Schism play about Henry VIII. Not just Catherine of Aragon is a wonderful part, but Anne Boleyn is a terrific part, and even our friend Bloody Mary has a very nice last couple of scenes. So he wrote really for powerful actresses on the stage, which is, they all did. Moretto wrote wonderfully for women, and Calderon wrote wonderfully for women as well.
it's like this amazing kind of natural experiment, right? So you have these two theaters emerging in very similar circumstances. And in one case, it's not like the moralists weren't exercised about having women on stage. It's just that in Spain, they were more worried about having the boys play women. And in England, they came to the opposite conclusion, right? But so you have this like natural experiment. What happens to the body of plays that emerges from a playwriting culture if you go one way or the other? And that's one of the really fascinating juxtapositions.
Do we know anything about at what point did these plays, the Spanish Golden Age plays, the Hispanic classics, begin to infiltrate England? I know, Rhonda, you were talking about Pestle, and the Don Quixote story made its way over, and they were reading the same Italian novellas. And I'm just wondering, at what point did Lope start to influence English drama, or do we know?
Yeah, so in the generation after Shakespeare, Fletcher is really the big figure for looking to Spain. In most cases, I would say, it's easier as a playwright if you've got a text you can look at, right? And so they are mostly taking from novellas. That seems to be the source for a lot of plays. And so Fletcher has, oh my gosh, I lose count, but Cervantes has a collection of novelas, the novelas ejemplares, and Fletcher makes plays out of a number of them, and then out of a number of episodes in Don Quixote as well, right? Without even counting Cardenio, which we can talk about also. It's in the Restoration, you start getting some plays which are recognizably versions of Spanish plays, and I would say that the canonization of certain plays as, these are the plays that represent Spanish theater, the reason that we read, El Alcalde de Zalamea and so on, that comes a little bit later. And I think it comes partly out of late 18th century, 19th century sense among Brits of what they thought Spain should be. So the play that confirms a sense that Spain is all about honor and Spaniards are a certain way, that play is legible and becomes canonized. And the plays where the characters are running around being well aware that honor is a performance and a facade, and that once you understand the system, you can work within it, those plays don't quite match, right? What these English scholars think Spain should be. And now it's up to us to rediscover them and make sure that audiences encounter them, because I think they match much more our sense of what the theater can be as a space for, thinking about how we all sort of fashion ourselves in a social space, right?
One of the plays I translated was, in fact, called No Puede Ser, or No Puede Ser Guardar una Mujer, was translated twice during the Restoration, or was adapted at least twice during the Restoration period in England on the orders of the king, who wanted a comedy, and he gave it to one of the playwrights and said, "I want you to translate this play." The results were pretty weird in both cases, but there's an example of that, of some Spanish plays making their way into the English repertoire in adaptation. One of them just used the central act and threw everything else out. The other did a kind of a version of the play, but it's the kind of play that Barbara's talking about. It so empowers women. And so presents such a complicated society in Spain. This whole thing about honor being, to never die for, and women just scheming their way around it all the time, is a picture that the English were rather surprised to find about Spain.
I wonder, Dakin, if I could ask you to, as an actor, since you have the unique perspective of having been an actor in so many of Shakespeare's plays, been a dramaturg in so many of them, and also having experienced your work with these plays and with Lope's play, what would you say are some of the key differences, what it is like inside the text from an actor's perspective when you're approaching, well, let's take Capulets and Montagues specifically, but Lope, of course.
Yeah, well, Lope especially, again, as Barbara points out, he loved to please his audiences. And if his audiences like something like Oleos, then that's what he gave them. So you will find scenes in here that have little or nothing to do with the primary plot or even the secondary plot. They're just in there because they're just wonderful or they're funny or something like that. He's also writing for his acting company, for what they can do. So what we've come to think of as like perfect structure of especially Shakespeare was an incredible dramaturg in the sense of structuring a play so that everything fed everything. You're not going to find that all the time in every Spanish play. That some plays are very freewheeling and scattering and kind of, very popular, very audience response driven, rather than having a strong central kind of engine that's driving it. So that's one thing you're going to find. And as an actor also, you have to be a good actor. You have to be able to understand. You do Shakespeare as well.
Oops, well, I think we lost Dakin's internet connection. He was saying something brilliant, and I hope he'll be able to rejoin us again soon. But while he's rejoining, I'll ask Rhonda or Barbara, perhaps you could talk a little bit about Lope's influence on other Hispanic playwrights. I know he was held up. He was such there. Dakin's back.
Okay.
Hold that question in your mind, Rhonda and Sharrah and Barbara. We'll come back to it. Dakin, we lost you right on the most important thing you were saying.
I think actors have to be very good rhetorical actors. Basically, they have to understand speech structure. I think Shakespearean actors have to do exactly the same thing, but you really have to understand speech structure, both in terms of when a speech is really terrifically organized, you have to be able to follow it point by point, especially if it's a long speech, so that you never lose the thread. And also, if you are given a speech in which a character is scattered, then you have to be able to understand the sort of disruptiveness of the speech. It's just more, and it's much more performative and presentational without ever losing side of the character.
No.
The internet is not cooperating with us, but we'll come back to Dakin. Well, anything you want to add to that, Rhonda or Barbara, or if you'd like to pick up my question about the influence on other Hispanic playwrights, I'd be interested in that. And I'll just take the moment to put out a plug to the online audience out there. Your questions are welcome. Start posting them, folks.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a little bit. I think again, what's interesting about Lope is he is such an outsized phenomenon. Cervantes calls him a monstruo de la naturaleza, a monster of nature. That there is really not a lot of alternative to this model that he offers, And so Cervantes in particular is pretty bitter because Cervantes, who's, about a few years older than Lope, but has written plays earlier in the old style, more longer, more acts, less lively, is very frustrated by the fact that Lope has really figured out the formula. So he has the opportunity in that rivalry to really get a sense from writers in the period of just how powerful and effective this new model that Lope was offering is. Similarly, we've also translated several plays by Guillem de Castro, a writer from Valencia. In Valencia, all the playwrights are sort of watching what Lope is doing, and sort of participating in those conversations about how to write plays when he's in exile there. And in Guillem de Castro, we also see a kind of evolution towards much more of a Lope model. And even the playwrights of a later generation, like Calderón and Ana Caro, are picking up on a lot of elements that Lope develops, right? No one goes back to anything other than 3 acts. Almost everyone takes up the figure of the gracioso that Lope develops, the sort of sidekick who is always ironically reflecting on the hero's actions, gives the opportunity for a dialogue instead of just those long speeches, and is often in Ana Caro, actually, you may remember, Jesse, this kind of figure who breaks the fourth wall, does a lot of reflecting on, we are in a play. These are all things that Lope sets up through the figure of the gracioso. So a lot of the elements really, really carry on. I would say, he's an extraordinarily powerful model.
Yeah. Also, a lot of the playwrights rewrote other playwrights, rewrote their own work. I mean, they had to keep producing plays, so a lot of them would take plots and plays written by themselves earlier in their lives or by other people or by other groups of people and would continue to rework them over the whole sort of 30 or 35-year period.
I see we have a question from Anne H. about speaking to, if one of you could speak also to the role of music in Lope and ballads.
Yeah, so we know, the verse structure is itself quite musical. I think that, well, let me start from the other side. We have some sense of the songs, but we know there was much more music than what we've kept. There were two musicians typically on stage. There was also music between the acts. It was, an afternoon at the theater. There were again, like in England, there were jigs, there were dances, there was music in addition to the play. We don't have nearly all of the music, but what's really interesting is because it is all in verse, it's very easy, for example, in a modern production to take the verse and set that to music, right? So in a production that we did a couple of years ago of one of our translations, Women and Servants, a musicologist at UCLA essentially took what were sort of standard folk rhythms of the period and set a chunk of the play to those. And it was amazing, right? So in a performance of our translation, the music served to give audiences a sense of what the language sounded like and, the musicality of it. And also, of course, added the music, which is such an important element in performance. Maybe this is the time to remind everyone that today really kind of kicks off the events of our theater festival. So if any of you are watching from LA, in addition to the online component, which is on Monday, the Zoom reading of Dakin's translation, we are actually having an entire theater festival in person, live at UCLA, showcasing Commedia. So La Escena, the third edition of our theater festival, is happening at UCLA. The in-person portion of it is from Friday, September 16th to September 18th. Tickets are free. Make your reservations. I have no idea who's watching. Unlike on Zoom, I can't really see who's out there. But if any of you are watching from LA, please do join us.
Some plays also do incorporate songs integrally into the plot. Moretto does quite a lot. Tirso does in the Burlador in the Don Juan play. So, Moretto would particularly really like to sort of have a song at the absolute central point of the play that sort of isolated and concentrated the themes of the play frequently.
Can I take the next question, Jesse?
Yes, please do.
So I don't know. Can anyone see it? Can everyone see it?
I'll read it out loud just real quickly. Melanie is asking any advice or recommendations on how to choose what to cut in Lope's scripts before producing a production. She'll be directing, I assume it's a she, his Widow of Valencia next year. So excited.
Yeah, so this is an amazing play about the woman who refuses to get married again and then likes some guy in the marketplace and has him brought to her at night. But the deal is he has to cover his head and not see her. So the power dynamics, very kinky, very interesting play. This is one of the key ones, I think, for this idea of honor as a facade, to the extent that really her house, I would say, is like a character in the play, right? That facade of nothing going on here, when in fact inside the house there's all kinds of stuff going on. So anyway, Melanie, to your question. So in our translations, we've really tried not to make that call for directors. And I'm just going to share a couple of stories of things that happened in stage readings and productions around cuts. It's not really a solution, but it might give you some things to think about. Early on, we did a stage reading of The Force of Habit, which is this amazing play about the siblings who are brought up in the opposite gender, and then the family is reunited, and the father and mother want to write, quote unquote, write their genders. Anyway, the father is quite the heavy. And we're watching this stage reading, and we realize he seems really sympathetic. And some of that is, the actor is very sympathetic, but then we're really sort of disturbed because the father, who's clearly the antagonist in this play, is coming across all too nicely. And then speaking to the director afterwards, we found out that she found him very repetitive and sort of rebarbative. And so she cut a lot of his lines. And it's really interesting because each of those cuts probably made a lot of sense to the director, but cumulatively, right, they really changed the balance of sympathy in the play in a way. So that's one. And then the other is in Lope's amazing Wild Night in Toledo. There is this moment, like Dakin was saying, of this speech as just a showpiece, you know? And so we're translating, it's like a description of the palace gardens in Aranjuez. And we are just dying, right? Because the flowers and the birds and all this time we're thinking we are sweating blood translating this thing, which any director is going to cut. But in fact, the first stage reading we do at UCLA with Michael Hackett, he also refuses to cut anything because we're sort of trying out the translation. And the actor is all over it. The actor is just eating this up, you know, because it is a showpiece. And so it doesn't add very much to the plot, but it really, you know, allows an actor to show off. So I didn't really answer your question. Write me, Melanie, and we can chat more. But I do think those are two really interesting examples of how things that we may think of as extraneous or de trop are actually carefully considered for certain aspects of performance.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll also say that for the festival that's coming up, we do have a version that's an adaptation of The Widow of Valencia that's going to be done, and it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. And it's always, we have this series called the Golden Tongue series, where playwrights do adaptations of commedia, and they always bring out really interesting things in them, because oftentimes they like modernize them or put them in a more contemporary setting. A lot of times it's in LA because it's like an LA-based program. And the playwrights do amazing things to kind of like pull out and make connections to like versions of these things about honor and, you know, public image and various things. So I think as far as like, you know, performances and cuts, I think maybe there's a little bit of an underestimation of what people can understand. I think if you have good actors and you have, you know, these texts that have been successful, that you can do a lot, even if they don't necessarily get every single reference or every single, you know, mythological figure or something like that. You can really pick up a lot. And I mean, I think that's also the case with Shakespeare, that I often like teach Shakespeare. And the thing is that we're familiar with them from long familiarity, but still a lot of the details are going to not necessarily be right to hand for many of the people who watch the plays. But whenever I teach them, I always try to provide some kind of recording for the students, because it really helps them to see it on stage. And I think that's kind of the power of performance and the power of the actors to make things really pop in a way that you might not expect when you first read it. So maybe don't cut things preemptively. That's maybe might be my advice.
Mine are a little harder to cut because I translate into rhyming verse. You know, if you have a translation that's prose or a translation that's blank verse, and Shakespeare in blank verse is quite easy to cut because you're not disrupting any stanzas. But if you have a very intricate rhyme scheme, I feel like, you know, you can't just cavalierly cut out 3 lines of a quintilla and keep going. You know, something's going to happen. Not that audiences hear the rhymes or recognize the stanzas, but it's just a sort of a thing that I have about verse, that it works subliminally, and you have to cut. You cut at your own risk. Also, I say don't cut something because you don't understand it. Understand it, and then if you understand it, you want to cut it. Okay, don't cut something because the audience won't understand it.
Yeah,
they might.
Go ahead. I would only add, well, Barbara, your 2 examples both involved performances of the text, and you know, in my experience, whenever we've done a reading of one of these plays or any play really with great actors, you learn so much from the actors and the audience, and you can really hear where something is just falling flat, and you can hear where something, you know instantly whether the audience is listening or sleeping or laughing, or so you learn a lot from a reading like that. So if you have the opportunity to do it in advance.
Besides that, the minute you cut a line, some actor will tell you that line is essential to my
most important line. Exactly. But
having said that, I do want to say that, you know, we translate every line because we do want to leave that decision to directors, Melanie. And then we are happy to have people change our text. We would like to, be consulted. We would love to help with that process, but we are very open to changes in the plays, because what we want is for audiences to see them. So we don't want a director to say, this is getting in the way. Change it.
That's a great resource you're providing. And PJ Horton has a question which I do want someone who knows the answer to answer. And I'm also going to throw a second question in, because we're running about 10 more minutes of talking, and I want to make sure we get back to Capulets and Montagues and Romeo and Juliet with I would love it if maybe, Dakin, this is best for you, if you could talk.
I don't think actually it would be fair to say that translations of Spanish plays were available in the Restoration period. I think English playwrights adapted or cannibalized them, but I don't think there were. I know what's her name? Afra Ben knew the Spanish plays pretty well, but would adopt or adapt their plot lines and sometimes their dialogue, not nearly as much as the continent. I mean, Molière simply stole whole chunks of El Destin con El Destin for his Princess of Elide, and Goldoni and Corneille simply stole La Verdad Sospechosa. They translated them into French or into Italian and put their name on it and said, this is my play. So that did not happen, as far as I know, in the Restoration in England.
Rhonda, Barbara, anything to add there?
I know I think there were some by George Digby that I've called their own plays. I don't know of necessarily other full translations. Like Dakin said, it was still a period of kind of very free for all. There wasn't anything like author, copyright or anything. So you kind of do whatever you dared, particularly in the case of translations or bringing things over from different countries, that you could kind of, steal whatever you wanted. But then, subsequently there were different translations, but like we said, a lot remain untranslated, have not been translated into English. And
Barbara, when do you think actual translations into English started? I mean, reliable translations that deserve the name translation.
Probably the early 19th century, I would say.
Yeah.
I have
Romantics,
see a first one, but yeah. And Calderón, of course, is very popular in Germany as well as in England, and there's a kind of much broader fascination with him in the Romantic period. I think that translation and adaptation are sort of on a continuum, and of course, you have Dryden writing his Tempest, right? So this is happening within the national literature, in addition to with the plays that are being.
Can I ask you a question? I think, Dakin, I'm directing it at you, because I don't know how many times you have been intimately involved with Romeo and Juliet. How many?
Well, let me see. I did Friar Lawrence at the Berkeley Shakespeare Festival, which was a really lovely production, and I did Capulet for Sir Peter Hall. And I think those are the only two that I've
actor, and you must have seen a number of productions, and then of course you worked on this play. So the Capulets and Montagues. So I guess where I'm leading is, I'm very curious, as someone who knows both plays so well, where there are places where if there are places where there's real overlap and resonance between the two texts that jump out at you, like, oh my gosh, Shakespeare and Lope both found this scene so important.
Yeah, yes, there are sometimes.
Maybe
there are some more often than not. There are divergences. Huh? I mean, you will find the same, say, 11 or 12 plot points in both plays, because they're taking it from the Bandello primarily. But we did one today where Juliet cries because Romeo has left, and her father catches her, and she claims that she's crying because her cousin Octavio, who was going to be her husband, has died. And that does, when Juliet is weeping, but for something other than what her parents think she's weeping for, that's one where there was a kind of a resonance, I think, for sure. There are times when it looks like Lope is going to parallel Shakespeare, and then every once in a while, he'll just veer off in a completely different direction. Now, audiences will always think that Lope is writing a parody or a spoof of Shakespeare. And of course, he didn't know the play at all. They will always, you can't stop them from having that experience. They will always think, oh, oh, Lope read that play by Shakespeare and thought he'd make fun of it. And of course, that is not true. But you can't stop that. In fact, that's one of the attractions of the play for an English-speaking audience. Their familiarity with the Romeo and Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare makes their theater-going experience all that more interesting.
Yes, and it's one of the reasons I'm interested in it. It's one of the reasons I got interested in the Jacobeans in the first place too. Half the time you're coming across the little digression. If you're doing "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," you're going, oh, but there's Othello, and there's Hamlet, and there's Romeo and Juliet, of course. So those resonances are one of the things that leads.
There is, for example, in the
Yeah.
tomb.
Yeah.
I mean, the tomb scene is very interesting. It's another one of those that Barbara pointed out, one of these daylight scenes, like Black Comedy. Remember Black Comedy, that one act that they used to do? The lights are on.
Yeah, Peter Schaffer.
Completely, and people are stumbling around like it's pitch black. So to establish this, somebody walks on with a lantern, they drop the lantern, and now the audience is supposed to imagine that it's pitch black.
Right.
Sor Juana has two of them in Los Empeños. And Lope has one in this one, where Romeo and his sidekick entered the tomb to find Juliet. They drop the lantern, and now suddenly they're all walking around like it's pitch black. I guess audiences thought I guess it can be very, very funny if you stage it right.
Now, have any of you had an experience? Forgive me if forgive me that I don't know this. Had an experience with this play in production?
I've produced it myself in Los Angeles, and I thought it was a very lovely, a very successful production. And then it was produced again in Canada by a school near Ontario. I can't remember the name of it. A big theater school up there, which was kind of fun.
We had some scenes last year when we did an event called Romeos y Julietas, when the public was doing its bilingual Romeo and Juliet, and Dakin's translation had just come out, so we also had a chance to look at some scenes then, which was super interesting.
It would be fun. I'm sure everyone's thinking this. It would be so much fun to see them in repertory with the same group of actors, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It would.
We'll try.
Well, of course, the thing that I did was I did not use Lope's proper names for the actors. I translated them all into the equivalent of what would have been Shakespeare's names, except for characters who were completely unique to Lope. So my Benvolio is not Benvolio in the Lope. And Romeo.
I'm sure that Lope would give you his blessing, right? Like you're just in the spirit of Lope. Absolutely, he wants it to work. He wants it to get in front of audiences. So, I was sure that he would be all for it.
Well, this is a great conversation, and we're looking forward to a live online reading of this on this coming Monday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern time, and you'll still be able to view it for a few days after, for I think 6 days after online, if you're not able to view it live as we do it with a great group of actors, including Dakin and Cara Ricketts and Carson Elrod and Junior Nyango, and a number of wonderful actors. And so we're just coming to the end of our time. So if there are any last questions or comments from the audience or comments from the panelists, now is your chance.
Let me just say quickly that it's very exciting to see some of the same actors, and of course to have Melia involved again, because I feel like these people are, they are sort of building up a repertoire in Spanish Golden Age now that we're in the third year of this collaboration. And it's very exciting because, as with Shakespeare, you sort of learn your way around a form. And I think that makes it more legible, more playable. And so it's great to see some of the familiar faces on the cast.
It was one of the joys of my life. When I first started translating these, I became a man on a mission, and I discovered two people or two groups that suddenly I allied with. One was the Comediantes, which is a group of scholars who are working very hard to get these plays translated and performed. And then I met with Barbara's group, Diversifying the Classics, and they've been stalwart supporters and great. I've learned so much from them, and it was so nice to find people on the same path who believed as strongly as I did that this needs to happen for the American theater.
Absolutely. And Barbara, I think both of you, and Barbara, you reached out to me 4 or 5 years ago, and we finally got this collaboration going. And of course, the pandemic threw it all into a tailspin, but it's been really wonderful to be able to, some of the actors who are involved are only able to be involved because they're in different parts of the country, and Milia included, our director. So in some ways, this online access is wonderful for us. And for those of you who are following Red Bull regularly, you know we're also working hard to provide both in-person and online experiences this year. And so for this collaboration, we certainly hope to be able to continue and to find ways to do it both in person and online in the future. There's a question from KF. It says, anyone know of a good biography on Lope in English? Did he only write for the public theater?
I'm not coming up with a biography. I mean, he writes all kinds of things. He's a very renowned poet. His sonnets are fabulous. He writes prose. Dakin, I was thinking about your memory of the House of Lope De Vega because I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and it was the anniversary of his death, and they had a small production in the garden, and it was mostly just a couple of actors. It was actually a musician playing guitar, and then an actress reading his poetry, and it was extraordinary. You know, poems about the garden, poems about love, poems about death, and you know, it's a side of Lope that, of course, fits into the playwriting because the plays are in verse. But it's another whole Lope. You know, Lope is taught in schools as a poet. So there is this entire other side to him that we, you know, again, much like Shakespeare, right? This is the creative juices are flowing so much that even the hundreds of plays, you know, cannot contain them. So there's also sonnets. Apparently, he wrote love letters for his patron. You know, this was part of his duties as secretary, or so they say. Dicen las malas lenguas. So
the thing is, he did write for the public theater. It wasn't quite like England, where there was like, obviously there would be court performances, but remember, there were public theaters all over Spain, as opposed to England, where they were all concentrated in London. And they were sort of nonprofits run by hospitals, kind of. The money went to hospitals, and they were formed. Many of them, the early ones, were not built for theater, but they were where an area in the center of a courtyard with buildings adjoining, and people would sell out their balconies and their windows so people could watch the plays.
This is actually kind of brilliant, PR move, right, on the part of the playwrights. If you say that the plays are for charity, it's much harder, you know, for them to shut you down.
Yeah.
Right? It goes to poor relief, and so we have to have these plays every afternoon, because what will these charities do without, you know, the box office take? So that is utterly brilliant. And in addition to there being theaters all around Spain, there are theaters all over the Americas. There are theaters in the Philippines. There's a sort of lively back and forth of plays and playwrights. Alarcón and Sor Juana are both playwrights born in what is now Mexico. And it really does become a kind of global theater in this era of Spain's empire.
And to answer the next question, where can you get the translations? Thanks to Barbara, her group, and I'm sort of an adjunct or an annex to her group, are having all these translations published by Linguatext in the Juan de la Cruz Hispanic monologues. And I think there must be about, how many are out now? Six of mine, I think, and maybe 10 of yours.
But yes, we're really getting up there. So Rhonda, do you have the book with you? Can you show?
Yeah, I do actually.
There we go.
And we'll try to figure out a way to get the link posted somewhere on our Facebook.
And I also publish acting editions myself, so we'll probably put a link on that. I have 11 so far. So
thank you, Rhonda. So that's a great note to be wrapping up the conversation on. Buy your text and follow along on Monday for the reading. That's all the time we have for tonight's discussion. Rhonda, Barbara, and Dakin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. That was great fun.
It really was informative, and it made me more excited to see the reading on Monday. And to our audience, I want to thank you all for tuning in tonight. This is the first of our programming of the 22-23 season, but there's a lot more to come, including this coming Monday's reading of the Capulets and the Montagues. And come join us again on Thursday for an online bull session where we'll be discussing the reading with Barbara, Dakin, and members of the reading company. And then coming up on Monday, October 3rd, we're having a remarkable conversation with Academy Award winner F. Murray Abraham, who will be discussing Shylock with Nathan Winkelstein, our Associate Artistic Director and the host of the Podversation series. And at the end of October, both in person and online, we're doing a restoration comedy, John Vanbrugh's The Relapse, and that'll be starring Michael Urie and Reg Rogers. That'll be both live in New York City and online for anyone who wants to join us online. That's on Monday, October 24th. Finally, none of our work is possible without your support. So I have to ask you, we are the charity in this case. Please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today at redbulltheater.com to support the vitality of classical theater. Every little bit helps. Thank you very much for your consideration. And thank you again to our guests. And my phone is ringing. I hope that's someone calling to donate or something. They're buying tickets for this work. They're buying tickets for the reading. Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Have a great night.
I know.